The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like insects trapped in glass, and Dr. Hargrove's voice cut through the morning briefing with the precision of a man who'd never been told no. 20 years. Danielle Ross had walked through emergency rooms in places where the ground itself seemed hostile, holding pressure on wounds that shouldn't have been survivable, and now she was here, in Norfolk, in Mercy General, invisible among nurses who didn't know her name. The antiseptic smell wrapped around her like a familiar shroud as she arrived for her first shift, her scrubs crisp, her badge clipped to her chest, and sewn inside the lining of her jacket, where no one would ever see it, a faded unit patch the color of old blood. The hallway stretched ahead of her in institutional white, and somewhere in that endless corridor, Dr. Hargrove was already planning how to break her. She didn't know that yet. She only knew the rhythm of morning rounds, the weight of the stethoscope around her neck, and the particular loneliness of starting over with nothing but your competence and a secret that would destroy you if anyone learned the truth. The ICU doors whispered open as she approached Station 7, and the head nurse, a woman named Patricia with kind eyes and 23 years of seniority, glanced up from her computer. "You're the new contract nurse," Patricia said, not unkindly. It wasn't a question. "Room 347 is yours. Patient admitted at 0347 this morning. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen. Trauma transfer from Naval Medical Center Portsmouth. Critical but stable." Danielle nodded, collected the chart, and moved toward the patient rooms with the economical grace of someone who'd learned long ago that unnecessary motion wastes energy. The chart was thin, most details sparse. Marcus Chen, 32 years old, admitted with internal injuries from a vehicle accident. The age registered somewhere in her peripheral awareness but didn't trigger recognition. That was how memory worked sometimes. The important details got filed away in the wrong drawer. The window in room 347 faced the parking lot. Rain had started sometime before dawn, and it sheeted against the glass like the world was trying to wash itself clean. Danielle pulled the chart closer and stepped inside, her eyes moving across the equipment first, always the equipment, before she registered the man in the bed. Ventilator hissed its mechanical rhythm. Heart monitor displayed a steady 84 beats per minute. For lines ran like tributaries up both arms. The patient's face was swollen from trauma, jaw wired shut, but his eyes tracked her movement with an alertness that suggested his mind was intact even if his body wasn't. She'd learned in her previous life, the life she no longer spoke of, that the ones who stayed alert were the ones with training. The ones who understood pain as information rather than catastrophe. "I'm going to check your vitals," she said, keeping her voice level and professional. "Blink once if you understand." He blinked once. His eyes were hazel, and there was something in them that almost broke her composure, but Danielle had trained herself years ago to compartmentalize the past into boxes so tight that nothing could escape. She took his blood pressure, 118/76, normal for someone in his condition, and made a note on the chart. His pupils were reactive. His breathing synchronized with the ventilator without fighting it. All the markers of a patient whose military training had taught him how to survive. She finished the assessment, documented her findings, and was turning to leave when his hand moved, a small gesture, barely a twitch of the fingers that weren't restrained by 4 lines. She paused. "Look back." He was trying to focus on her face, trying to communicate something she couldn't read. "Rest," she said quietly. "You're safe. I'll be right outside." It was a promise she meant with every fiber of her being, and that was dangerous. Attachment was dangerous. Memory was dangerous. The break room at 0818 smelled like cold coffee and someone's sad tuna sandwich from yesterday, and Danielle was sitting at the small laminate table, eating a salad from a container marked with yesterday's date, when Dr. Hargrove entered. He was tall, that was the first thing people noticed about him. 6'3", maybe 4. He dressed expensive, the kind of clothes that announced themselves, and his presence in the room created a pressure change, like altitude dropping. He moved to the refrigerator and pulled out a bottled water, and he did it in a way that suggested he owned the space. When he turned and saw Danielle, something shifted in his expression. Not recognition. Calculation. "You're the new contract hire," he said. It wasn't a question. Danielle. I'm Dr. Hargrove. I run this ICU. He held the water bottle like a scepter. Around him, 3 other nurses had gone very still. The room had compressed somehow. I like to make something clear on day one, he continued, his voice carrying the casual confidence of a man who'd never experienced professional consequences. He turned to face the room, not just Danielle, but everyone. I'll bet $50 she quits within a week. Any takers? One of the male nurses laughed, a sound like gravel shifting. 2 others exchanged glances. Danielle set down her fork with deliberate care. She didn't respond. Didn't make eye contact. Didn't let anything cross her face except the metered calm of someone counting breaths. 1, 2, 3. The kind of breathing they taught you before the mortars started falling. $50, Hargrove said again, louder this time, performing for his audience. She walks out Friday. He took a long drink of water and left, and the room exhaled like a creature that had been holding its breath. Patricia was watching her with something like sympathy in her eyes, but Danielle simply returned to her salad. The lettuce was bland. Everything about civilian life was bland until you got used to it again, and she was still working on getting used to it. Lunch came at 11:57, and Danielle moved through the cafeteria line with a tray that held a sandwich, an apple, and a bottle of water. The food service worker smiled at her, a genuine smile, the kind that suggested she hadn't yet heard about Dr. Hargrove's bet. She found a small table near the window, away from the clusters of staff, and was setting her tray down when the universe compressed itself into a single moment. A hand came up beneath her tray from the side, sudden and deliberate. Hargrove. He was moving past her table, and he tilted the tray upward with the casual cruelty of someone swatting at an insect. The sandwich tumbled. The apple rolled across the tile floor like it was escaping. Water cascaded down the front of her scrubs, soaking the blue fabric. Around her, a handful of nurses had stopped moving. Someone laughed, a sound without joy. Hargrove didn't pause. Didn't look back. Just continued toward the exit with the satisfaction of a man who'd successfully demonstrated his power. Danielle sat motionless for exactly 3 seconds. Rain hammered the cafeteria windows. Then she stood, picked up the empty tray, set it on the counter, and walked to the bathroom to dry her scrubs under the hand dryer. She didn't cry. Didn't let her hand shake. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was muscle memory from 20 years of absorbing worse things than a dropped lunch from a man who had no idea who he was playing with. When she returned to the ICU, Patricia met her in the hallway. That was, Patricia started, but Danielle simply said, "I need some Jell-O," and continued toward the supply closet like nothing had happened. The head nurse stared after her, something dawning in her expression, the first crack in the assumption that Danielle was just another disposable contract nurse. The rest of her shift moved like water. Vitals, assessments, documentation. Room 347 required a blood draw at 14:32. And when she entered, Marcus Chen's eyes were alert again, tracking her approach. She didn't look at his face. Couldn't. Instead, she focused on the tourniquet, the vein selection, the decisive insertion of the needle. The blood flowed dark and true into the collection tube. "Got it," she murmured, completing the procedure with the efficiency of someone who'd done this thousands of times. His eyes were still on her when she turned to leave, and she felt the weight of that attention like a physical thing. Some memories live in the body before the mind catches up. Some recognitions don't need words. But Danielle had learned how to outrun both. She documented the draw, delivered the specimen to the lab, and moved on to the next patient, the next room, the next small mechanical task that kept her from thinking about the faded patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the unit designation from a life where people called her senior chief and meant it with a kind of respect that didn't exist in civilian spaces. That night, driving home through rain that hammered the windshield like accusations, she didn't think about the bet Hargrove had made. Didn't think about the tray or the laughter or the way his hand had felt beneath her food like an extension of contempt. She thought instead about the man in room 347 and the way his eyes had moved, searching for something in her face that she'd promised herself he would never find. The chart landed at her feet like a thrown gauntlet. Danielle didn't flinch. Didn't blink. The paper scattered across the tile in a spray of white and blue, patient notes spilling their secrets across the floor of the ICU hallway where 3 nurses were restocking the medication cart. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway with his hands on his hips, his expression a perfect rendering of contempt, his voice pitched loud enough to carry down the corridor. "Pick that up, sweetheart. Looks like you're better suited for housekeeping anyway." The laughter came instantly, not from all of them, but enough. A respiratory therapist smirked. One of the day shift nurses turned away, busying herself with unnecessary chart reviews. The other 2 said nothing. They watched. They always watched. Danielle crouched. Gathered the chart slowly, methodically, each movement controlled. One measured breath in. The papers bent slightly as she collected them, her hand steady as they scooped up the remnants of someone else's trauma, someone else's crisis reduced to scatter on the floor. When she stood, the chart stacked neat against her chest, she looked directly at Hargrove. Not down. Not away. Directly at him. Her voice came quiet, almost conversational, carrying the weight of something he couldn't name. "I've been called worse by better men." The hallway went still. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric song above them. Hargrove's face darkened like a bruise spreading beneath skin. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Turned and walked away, his cologne lingering like an accusation. She returned the charts to their proper slots. Finished the medication rounds. Didn't acknowledge the respiratory therapist's sudden interest in his shoes or the way the day shift nurse found reasons to pass by her station 3 more times, perhaps waiting for her to crack, to snap back, to give them a fight they could understand. Around 9:27 p.m., when the unit finally quieted, when most of the visitors had cleared and the overhead pages became sporadic enough to count on one hand, Danielle found herself in the staff bathroom with her hands gripping the sink. The fluorescent light above the mirror buzzed with an insect's urgency. In the glass, her reflection showed her own face, composed, unbroken, and then a single tear slipped down her cheek like a traitor. She wiped it immediately, refusing to blink, refusing to look away from herself. The tear was weakness. The tear was the old life trying to surface. She would not allow it. She steadied her breathing and walked back out into the unit, back to the charts, back to the work that would never acknowledge her or thank her or know what she'd already survived. 3 nights later, at 2:13 a.m., when the unit was skeleton crew and the halls belonged mostly to the machines, Danielle pulled up the billing database during her documentation time. A routine check, she'd always been thorough, always paid attention to the numbers because numbers told stories that charts sometimes hid. What she found didn't make sense. Procedure codes marked up by 40%. Supply orders from Meridian Medical billed at double cost, invoiced to Mercy General 3 times in the past 8 weeks. The dates aligned with Hargrove's shift schedule. The patterns formed something ugly and deliberate when you knew how to read them. She was still scrolling, still cataloguing the discrepancies, when she felt the change in air pressure behind her. Hargrove stood in the doorway of the med room, his tablet hanging from one hand, his face moving through several expressions before settling on something cold and controlled. "Working late, are we?" His voice had shifted. The casual cruelty was gone, replaced by something more dangerous, calculation. She closed the screen without hurrying. Turned to face him with the same composed expression she'd offered during the chart incident, though her fingers had gone very still at her sides. "Finishing documentation," she said. 8-hour shifts don't leave much time for detail work. He moved closer. The smell of his cologne intensified, something expensive that didn't belong in a hospital. "You seem very interested in our billing practices." Very thorough. The way he emphasized that last word made it clear it wasn't a compliment. "It's important to know how the numbers work," she replied, keeping her voice level. "Accuracy matters." Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who'd just made a decision. "I'm sure it does." "Well, don't let me interrupt your studies." He didn't leave immediately. He stood there for a long moment, letting her feel the weight of his attention, before he turned and walked back toward the main unit. The next morning, there was a disciplinary notice in her file. Tardiness on 6 occasions dating back to her first week. She pulled the punch records, all early, some by 10 minutes, others by more. She could prove it with a single timestamp. The second notice came 4 days later. A medication error in the chart of a patient in room 341, Mr. Jerome Patterson. Danielle pulled his record. She'd administered his 6:06 a.m. antibiotics at 5:58 a.m., documented correctly, and the man himself was awake when she'd entered, had spoken with her, had said "thank you, honey" in that gentle voice of his. She found him in his room the next afternoon, asked quietly if there'd been any issues with his medications. He'd looked at her with confusion and something like sadness. "No, sweetheart. You're one of the good ones. Always careful with us." The third notice came 1 week later, patient complaints from multiple rooms. Names of people she'd cared for, people who'd thanked her, people who'd pressed her hand and called her an angel. Now they'd supposedly filed formal grievances. She called 3 of them before she understood. They hadn't filed anything. None of them even knew why hospital administration was contacting them with scripted questions designed to elicit specific answers. Through it all, she absorbed each accusation with that same measured breath. Each fabrication met with the same quiet dignity that had first drawn Hargrove's attention, and his rage. She didn't defend herself publicly. Didn't cry in the break room or call a lawyer or rage against the absurdity of it. Instead, she came to work at 5:44 a.m. every morning, clocked in, and moved through Mercy General like a ghost moving through a cathedral, present but untouched, professional but unreachable. Her colleagues began avoiding her. The stain had spread. She was trouble now. Hargrove's creation had taken on a life of its own. Conversation stopped when she entered the staff room. The roster started listing her for understaffed shifts and impossible combinations, the kind that wore people down deliberately. She took them all without complaint. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, that small rectangle of cloth with a symbol most people would never recognize, pressed against her ribs like a secret heartbeat through all of it. In the bathroom mirrors late at night, when she should have been sleeping but wasn't, she could almost feel it through her skin. A reminder of who she'd been. A warning about who she still was, even as she walked these fluorescent halls accepting humiliation from a man who thought he understood power. He didn't. He was playing checkers in a room full of strategic soldiers. But he didn't know that yet. None of them did. And while Danielle endured Hargrove's calculated campaign in the ICU of Mercy General, Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen lay sleeping in room 347, his body broken and healing, his dreams spinning back across 20 years to a moment he couldn't quite remember, a woman's hands lifting him from rubble in Marja, a voice cutting through the chaos like a lifeline. He didn't know her name. He'd been 8 years old. She'd pulled him toward the light. And that same woman was now moving through the halls above his head, counting down the hours until the quiet ticking inside his chest would demand everything she'd learned in a life she'd promised herself was finished. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm as Danielle moved through the ICU rounds, checking vitals on the 7 patients under her watch. Room 347 held Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen, still sedated, his chart still sparse, transferred 3 days ago from surgical trauma, stable but guarded. She'd memorized his vitals without trying. 54 beats per minute. Blood pressure 117/72. O2 sat 94 on 2 liters. The kind of numbers you trust until the second you don't. It happened at 14:38 on a Tuesday afternoon in October. She was updating his medication log when his chest went rigid. Not a breath. Not a flex. Rigid. The kind of sudden stillness that has no innocent explanation. His trachea deviated visibly to the right, the cartilage pushing sideways like something inside was fighting to escape. The ventilator's alarm shrieked, a sound like glass breaking in a tunnel. Oxygen saturation plummeting. 92. 87. 79. falling faster than physiology should allow. Tension pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was compressing his heart. Every heartbeat was pumping against a wall of pressure. He had minutes. Maybe less. Danielle did not call for the code team. Did not wait for Dr. Hargrove's authorization. Did not reach for the phone or the intercom or any of the bureaucratic delays that kill people in hospitals every single day. Her hands moved to the crash cart, steady as a surgical laser, and pulled the 14-gauge angiocath needle from the emergency decompression kit. These hands had done this before in a field hospital in Helmand Province with a dust storm howling outside and a boy's collapsed lung filling with air he couldn't breathe. These hands knew exactly what to do. "I need everyone back," she said. Her voice had dropped an octave. The 3 residents rounding with Dr. Hargrove froze. She wasn't asking. She wasn't requesting. She was commanding. Danielle's fingers located the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line on Chen's right side, the anatomical landmark burned into muscle memory from 2 decades of training that never really left you. She didn't hesitate. The needle went in clean, perpendicular to the rib, sliding through skin and fascia and pleural space with the kind of precision that comes from bodies and timing aligning like a prayer answered. The hiss came first. Air escaping. The sound of pressure releasing like opening a valve on a pressurized tank. The hiss of survival. Chen's body convulsed once, his lungs suddenly able to expand, his heart suddenly freed from the crushing weight of a rogue pneumothorax. The ventilator alarm quieted. The chest wall softened. The trachea realigned, sliding back to center like a correction being made. Oxygen saturation, 68. Her other hand was already readjusting the oxygen flow. 75. 82. 88. 92. 100%, climbing steady as the collapsed lung re-inflated, as the pressure gradient normalized, as the rib cage began moving again with the mechanical rhythm of the ventilator doing its job properly now without a collapsed lung fighting back. Stable. The monitor's rhythm settled into something sustainable. Sinus rhythm. Regular. Predictable. Alive. But her mind was somewhere else entirely. Sand in her throat. Mortar fire close enough that the concussion was a physical thing, a weight pressing down from the sky. The compound in Marja where they'd gone in at 0:30 because someone had called in an IED casualty and the nearest field hospital was an hour out by rota. She was 34 years old and she'd already forgotten what sleep felt like. The courtyard was rubble and dust and the smell of explosive residue, ozone and copper and burning things that shouldn't burn. A boy, 8 years old, maybe 9, eyes huge in his dirt-covered face, was pinned under a collapsed wall, his chest crushed, his breathing making the sound of a vacuum with a hole in it, that terrible whistling that means air is going where it shouldn't. She dug. 2 hours with her own hands and a combat engineer's entrenching tool, scraping away concrete and rebar while rounds snapped overhead and someone was screaming in Arabic and she was doing field triage in her head. He's got maybe 5 minutes before the compression trauma kills him, step back and let him die or go forward and risk everyone. She went forward. The boy was lighter than she expected. All bones and terror and desperate gasping. She'd secured his airway in the dust while the combat medic held pressure on the crush injury, needle decompression at the second intercostal space exactly like this, exactly now, the hiss of air releasing and the boy's eyes clearing, life flooding back into the shocked pupils when his lungs could breathe again. Danielle's hands moved to secure the needle with tape. No tremor. No hesitation. The clinical focus never wavered even though the boy in the bed was the same boy from Marja, older now, soldier now. But the essential thing was unchanged, he needed air and she was the only one in this room who knew how to give it to him. That was a 14-gauge decompression for tension pneumothorax, she said. Her voice was level. Clinical. The voice of someone who'd done this before and would do it again without flinching. She was still breathing normally. Her pulse was steady. She'd learned a long time ago how to separate the past from the present, how to let muscle memory carry the weight while her mind stayed operational. His lung should re-expand over the next hour. Monitor breath sounds bilaterally. Call respiratory if the oxygen demands increase. The room had gone dead silent. One of the residents was staring at her hands. Another was looking at her face, trying to parse something that didn't fit the profile of the quiet contract nurse who'd been cleaning supply carts and fetching medications for 6 months. Dr. Hargrove stood in the doorway with his mouth slightly open, the expression of a man watching someone he'd marked as invisible suddenly move with precision and authority he didn't know how to challenge. She'd already turned back to Chen's chart, documenting the procedure with clinical detachment. 74-year-old male, post-surgical, sudden tension pneumothorax secondary to likely visceral tear, needle decompression performed at bedside, O2 saturation recovered to 100%, patient stable and responsive to mechanical ventilation. Her handwriting didn't shake. The words were exact and professional and gave no indication that she'd just time-traveled backward 2 decades while her hands performed emergency surgery. But something in the room had shifted. The residents were exchanging glances. One of them, the tall one from Johns Hopkins with the expensive watch, was looking at her left wrist, at the thin line of scar tissue that ran from her thumb to her forearm. She'd gotten it in Kandahar when a piece of shrapnel had come within a millimeter of the radial artery. It had healed badly. The kind of scar you didn't get from civilian life. Hargrove was still watching. His jaw had tightened, the muscles working. Not angry yet. Not quite. But calculating. The same expression a chess player gets when he realizes the opponent just moved a piece that shouldn't exist on the board. Dr. Hargrove, she said, and her voice was different now. Not deferential. Not asking permission. The patient is stable. He'll need close monitoring for the next 6 hours. Likely need CT imaging once he's hemodynamically secure, and probably interventional radiology if there's ongoing air leak, but right now his breathing and his heart's working. That's the win. She hadn't said sir. She hadn't apologized for acting without authorization. She'd stated facts and made a clinical recommendation like she had the authority to do so, like she'd never been anyone's target practice or anyone's entertainment. The pressure in the room was building like weather before a storm. The hiss of released pressure told her everything. Chen's chest fell. The monitor climbed, 75. 82, 88. Sinus rhythm. The room went dead silent. Then Hargrove exploded through the door. What the hell did you just do? His face was the color of old brick. Not confused. Not concerned. Furious. You performed an unauthorized procedure on my patient without. His oxygen saturation was 44%, Danielle said, her voice level as a surgical field. Tension pneumothorax. Trachea deviated. The lung was collapsing. A needle decompression at the second intercostal space was the only intervention that would keep him alive for the next 8 minutes until thoracics could intubate him. I don't care if you performed open cardiac massage with your bare hands, Hargrove's voice had climbed to the pitch that made interns flinch. You don't make those calls. You call me. You wait for orders from your supervising physician, not, he stopped. His phone was already in his hand. His fingers moved across the screen in quick, deliberate bursts. Texting. Multiple messages. His face had shifted from rage to something colder. Calculation. Like a man calling in every favor he possessed, activating every contact in his network before the walls closed in. Security arrived for minutes later. She'd expected them. Somehow, she'd known the moment Hargrove's eyes had changed from angry to strategic. The guards were apologetic, they knew her, had watched her work 16-hour shifts without complaint, but they had their orders. One of them, a man named Rodriguez who'd helped her carry supplies to the ICU 2 weeks prior, wouldn't meet her eye. Administrative meeting, Ms. Ross. Right now. Bring your badge. The hallway felt longer than it had on her first day. The fluorescent lights hummed their electric hum, a sound she'd learned to filter out, but now every footstep sounded like a countdown. Rodriguez walked 3 paces behind her, not restraining her, not treating her like a suspect, but making sure she went exactly where she was told. The administrator's office was on the 3rd floor. Danielle had been there once before, when she was hired. Everything was beige. Beige walls, beige carpet, a beige leather chair behind a mahogany desk that probably cost more than she made in 6 months. The administrator, a woman named Patricia Westin with the posture of someone who'd never worked a 12-hour shift in her life, was flanked by 2 board members in suits that spoke of country club memberships and inherited wealth. Hargrove was already there. And so was a man Danielle had never seen before, a sharp suit, sharper eyes, the bearing of someone who specialized in taking apart people's careers. "Ms. Ross," the investigator said, not offering his hand. "My name is David Sterling. I've been retained by Mercy General's insurance carrier to review your actions in the ICU during the shift ending at 6:13 a.m. Sit down, please." She didn't sit. Not yet. She'd learned something in 20 years of hospitals: never sit first. Let them define the space. "Before we proceed," Sterling continued, opening a leather portfolio that contained what looked like a stack of documents, "I want to walk you through the disciplinary history in your file. Tardiness on 7 occasions. 2 medication administration errors in critical patients. A complaint from a patient about dismissive treatment. Another complaint about improper wound care. These are serious issues, Ms. Ross. And now, today, an unauthorized procedure that violated hospital protocol, direct orders from Dr. Hargrove, and those disciplinary reports are fabricated," Danielle said. Her voice didn't change. It was the tone she used when requesting supplies or reporting vitals. Flat. Observable. Fact-based. Every single one. I can provide the electronic timestamps on my badge access to the hospital to show I was on premises for all 7 dates listed as tardiness violations. I can provide the pharmacy records showing 0 medication errors. The patient complaints don't exist in the system. They were added to my file by. Those are serious accusations. Sterling's eyes had narrowed. Are you suggesting Dr. Hargrove fabricated? I'm stating what I observed. Danielle looked directly at Hargrove. Not an attack. Just an acknowledgement. I saw the billing codes. The ones you were reviewing at 2:51 a.m. on March 14th. The inflated procedure costs. The kickback arrangements with Valley Medical Supply. That's why the disciplinary report started appearing in my file. That's why this meeting is happening. The silence that followed was the kind that usually preceded something loud. Hargrove stood up. She's unbalanced. Look at her, she's clearly unstable. This is exactly the kind of security, one of the board members called out. His voice was different now. Thin. Uncertain. Like a man who'd just realized he was standing on a floor that might be collapsing beneath him. 2 security guards entered through the side door. Not Rodriguez. 2 larger men, neither of whom had watched her work. One of them held a cardboard box. "Your personal effects from your locker," Patricia Westin said, her hands folded on the desk with surgical precision. "Your employment with Mercy General is terminated, effective immediately. You will surrender your badge, your access card, and your hospital credentials. Security will escort you from the building. You are not to return without authorization from administration. There will be no severance. There will be no unemployment benefits pending the investigation into these allegations." Danielle removed her badge. The lanyard felt lighter than it should have. She'd worn it for exactly 6 months and 13 days. She placed it on the desk. The cardboard box held her things: a spare stethoscope, 3 pairs of compression socks, a book she'd been reading in the break room, a framed photograph of the Marja checkpoint where she'd served, though the faces had been deliberately blurred so no one would ask questions. At the bottom, wrapped in an old surgical towel, was the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, the only tangible piece of her former life she'd brought into this one. She picked up the box. No one spoke. No one offered to help her carry it. Rodriguez was waiting by the elevator, and when their eyes met, she saw something there, a kind of recognition, maybe, or apology, but he didn't speak either. The parking garage echoed with the sound of her footsteps. Level C3, where she'd parked her 2006 Honda Civic with the cracked windshield and the check engine light that had been on since 2019. Her car. Her job, gone. Her identity, still hidden. The box sat in the passenger seat like a small, cardboard gravestone. She drove to the Norfolk VA hospital. She'd treated patients there for 15 months before coming to Mercy General. The building was older, smaller, less aggressively clean. It smelled like coffee and antiseptic and something else, something like surrender. Like men and women who'd given up parts of themselves and were learning to live with what remained. The waiting room was half full at 18:22 in the evening. A Vietnam-era Marine with a prosthetic leg. 2 younger guys, maybe late 20s, with the 1,000-yard stare that came from multiple tours. A woman in a National Guard uniform with scars down one side of her neck. And others, all of them people Danielle had cared for. People whose wounds she understood because she carried similar ones, invisible though they were. She approached the intake desk. "First-time visit?" the clerk asked, not looking up from her computer. "Yes," Danielle said. It was the most honest lie she'd told in 6 months. The intake form asked for her name, her service history, her presenting complaint. Her hands shook as she filled it out. Not from fear. From the recognition that she was about to sit in this waiting room as what she'd been running from, not as a caregiver, but as a patient. Not as Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, but as Danielle. Just Danielle. Just a woman who'd been fired from a hospital that morning and had nowhere else to go. She sat on a plastic chair that was bolted to the floor. Around her, the veterans didn't recognize her. Why would they? They'd seen her in scrubs, had been in no condition to remember a face, and she'd made sure never to speak more than necessary. She was just one of hundreds of nurses they'd encountered in rooms where they were at their most vulnerable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. That sound again. Always that sound. It pressed against her eardrums like a memory she couldn't quite access. Like the thump of rotor blades that she'd learned, through thousands of hours of therapy, to distinguish from the hum of the world spinning on its normal axis. She looked down at the intake form trembling in her hands. Name, Danielle Ross. Service, U.S. Navy. Presenting complaint, PTSD. Occupational trauma. Career termination. Loss of identity. All of it true. All of it invisible to everyone around her. And then, from somewhere in the distance, so faint at first she thought she'd imagined it, came a sound that made her grip tighten on the clipboard. A rhythmic thumping. Low. Deliberate. Growing louder. The rotor blades. Not a metaphor. Not a memory. Real. Actual helicopter rotors, moving toward the building with the kind of purpose that made the waiting room go quiet. The Vietnam-era Marine looked up. One of the younger guys stood. The woman in the National Guard uniform moved to the window. Through the glass, across the parking lot, 2 massive silhouettes descended through the evening haze. Chinook helicopters. Danielle's hands had started to shake. But not from fear. From something else. Something that felt like the ground beneath her shifting from solid earth to something that might actually hold her weight. The engines wound down. The rotors slowed. And through the waiting room door, boots on tile, 1, 2, 3, 4, came voices that carried the weight of authority she'd thought she'd left behind. Danielle Ross. A man in dress uniform, insignia on his collar that meant he was used to giving orders and having them followed. She looked up from the intake form. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross." The room had gone silent. Every veteran in that waiting room turned to look at her. The woman at the intake desk had stopped typing. The waiting room had become a space where time had shifted into something else entirely. Danielle stood. The officer's eyes moved from her face to her hands, and something changed in his expression. A recognition. Or maybe just a confirmation of something he'd already been told. He said, and the respect in that single word carried the weight of 2 decades. We need you right now. She was 2 miles into her walk home, box tucked under one arm and eyes fixed on the sidewalk, when the rhythmic thump of rotor blades made her look up. 2 Chinook helicopters descended toward the empty lot beside the road, their downdraft immediate and violent. Termination papers scattered across the asphalt like autumn leaves, spinning in the rotor wash. The wind knocked her backward a step. She planted her feet. Didn't flinch. The first helicopter settled onto the cracked pavement, dust and debris swirling in a maelstrom around the fuselage. The rear ramp lowered with a hydraulic hiss. Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen emerged first, supported by 2 Navy SEALs in tactical gear, his left arm wrapped in fresh bandages. His eyes found her across the distance and held. He mouthed something. Then he spoke, his voice carrying across the dying engines with the force of an order. Senior Chief Petty Officer Ross, we need you right now. The world tilted. She hadn't heard that title spoken aloud in 6 years. Not since she'd signed her discharge papers and walked away from a life that had demanded everything and left her hollow. Senior Chief. A rank she'd earned in deserts she couldn't forget, among people she couldn't save, until the nightmares stopped feeling like memories and started feeling like prophecies. She'd buried that rank inside her jacket lining along with the faded unit patch. She'd become just a nurse. Invisible. Safe. A SEAL commander stepped toward her, his movements precise as a surgeon's, and handed her a classified folder stamped with red headers that made her stomach drop. His voice was low but carried absolute authority. Biological containment breach. Research facility outside Marja. 3 minutes ago we received notification. He paused, letting the location land like a punch. You're the only corpsman who's been inside that compound and survived the protocols. She opened the folder with hands that felt like they belonged to someone else. The content swam in front of her eyes. Marja. The same facility. The same coordinates she'd tried to forget. 43 people infected. Projected mortality rate without intervention, 98%. The virus name was redacted but she knew it anyway. Hemorrhagic fever. The kind that turned lungs to fluid and made families unrecognizable in their final hours. The kind she'd treated in a tent clinic with no running water and expired medications while mortars fell outside the perimeter. The second SEAL stepped forward, a man with silver at his temples and the bearing of someone who'd spent 3 decades making impossible decisions. His voice was reverent in a way that made her chest ache. Senior Chief Ross. 2 Navy crosses. He paused. She felt the words landing like stones in water. 3 bronze stars with valor. Another pause. The other SEAL's expression had shifted. Chen was watching her with an intensity that suggested he understood what was happening. You are the only field medic to successfully treat hemorrhagic fever in a combat zone. The SEAL commander stepped closer. There are 40 people dying. You're being recalled to active duty by direct order of JSOC. It wasn't a request. Her hands moved to her chest, pressing against the unit patch beneath her scrubs, still there after 6 years like a second heartbeat. The trembling that started in her fingers wasn't fear. It was recognition. It was the moment the mask cracked open and revealed the face beneath. She looked at Chen. Really looked at him. Tried to match the man in front of her to the 8-year-old boy she'd pulled from collapsed concrete and rubble in Marja 20 years ago. The boy whose mother had already been gone. Whose father was hemorrhaging internally. Whose small hands had clutched her uniform while she whispered that he was going to live. And somehow, impossibly, he had. Move, she said. Her voice had changed already. Dropped an octave. The tentative cadence of a contract nurse replaced by the precision of command. She handed the folder back to the SEAL commander and began walking toward the helicopter. Show me the containment protocols. At Mercy General Hospital, 43 miles away, the same security guard who had handed Danielle her cardboard box of belongings 8 hours earlier now stood in Dr. Hargrove's office on the 5th floor. The afternoon light was cutting across the desk in golden rectangles. Hargrove sat in his leather chair, the one he'd paid for with kickbacks disguised as consulting fees. The guard placed an identical cardboard box on the desk with deliberate slowness. Beside him stood two FBI agents in dark suits, their badges catching the light like accusations. The guard's voice was neutral, but his eyes held satisfaction. "I believe you know the way out, sir." Hargrove's face went the color of old paper. He tried to stand. One of the agents placed a hand on his shoulder, gentle but immovable. The other agent was photographing documents, emails, invoices, spreadsheets detailing phantom procedures and inflated surgical costs. $900,000 funneled through a medical supply company owned by Hargrove's brother-in-law. Insurance fraud spanning 18 months. Kickback payments to 5 other physicians. The scheme would have worked if he hadn't been so focused on destroying the one person who'd gotten close to his secrets. "You can't," Hargrove started. "Dr. Hargrove, you have the right to remain silent," the first agent said, pulling silver handcuffs from his belt. The metal clicked as they tightened around Hargrove's wrists. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." The guard walked out of the office without watching the rest. He'd already seen what he needed to see, the moment Hargrove understood that his network had crumbled. The moment he realized the nurse he'd tried so hard to break had been protected by something he could never compete with. Not tenure. Not politics. Not favors. The United States military command structure. Jock. A woman who'd spent 20 years saving lives in the places where death arrived first. The nurse had never been just a nurse. By the time they led Hargrove out past the ICU nurse's station, his face had gone slack. The nurses paused in their work. None of them moved. None of them spoke. They simply watched him pass, understanding flooding through the silence like a current. The woman they'd seen absorb every cruelty without breaking had been measured in metrics they couldn't comprehend. Navy Crosses. Bronze Stars. The ability to walk into active medical crises and save people that medicine had already surrendered. The security guard held the stairwell door open. Hargrove shuffled through it, his dress shoes scuffing on the tile. His future was already collapsing behind him. The medical board would revoke his license by month's end. The hospital would announce the fraud to the media. The other doctors would distance themselves with the speed of sharks abandoning a corpse. He would lose the colonial house in Virginia Beach. He would lose the Tesla parked in the reserved spot. He would lose the ability to walk into a room and have people assume he belonged there. 6 months later, he would be teaching CPR certifications at a community college in Tucson, Arizona, for $18 an hour. The nameplate on his desk would read Steve. When students called him doctor, he would flinch like the word was a bullet. His hands, which had once made decisions about life and death with casual arrogance, would now guide plastic mannequins through compressions. 30 chest compressions. 2 rescue breaths. 30 more. Again. 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 The only rhythm his hands would ever master again was the mechanical pulse of something that had never been alive. But in the helicopter, Danielle Ross was already a different person. The SEAL commander handed her a tablet displaying real-time satellite imagery of the research compound and the medical team on the ground. 43 people in a controlled environment. Hemorrhagic fever variant. Treatment protocols she developed in a tent with flashlights and determination. The helicopter was climbing to 2,000 feet, banking east, and her mind was already 3 steps ahead, running through scenarios, calculating drug interactions, remembering the precise pressure needed to secure and fall line in a patient whose veins had collapsed. She looked at Chen across the cargo hold. The young SEAL had positioned himself where she could see him. Watching her. Trusting her. The way the 8-year-old boy had, in a world that was falling apart. 43, she asked the SEAL commander. 43, he confirmed. She pressed her hand against the unit patch beneath her borrowed flight suit. The faded material was still there. Proof that some people never really leave who they were. They just wait for the moment when the world stops being kind and they remember how to survive. Then we don't lose one, she said. Her voice carried through the helicopter like steel singing. The rotor blades climbed to speed. The desert unfolded below them, exactly as she remembered it. And Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, who had spent 6 years learning to be invisible, was finally becoming impossible to ignore. The question isn't whether she saved those 43 people. The real question is, what do we owe the ones who walk among us in borrowed uniforms, carrying secrets that could break us? Have you ever passed someone and had no idea what they were truly capable of? What they were truly willing to sacrifice? Subscribe and let us know in the comments, because the quietest person in your life might just be the most essential.